Hi friends, this is Josh from Narrate. Narrate is currently in the series I've Got Questions. This talk is titled, Did God Die in 1859? Enjoy.
So you're back. Could never be too sure after last week whether it would be just me and the staff doing Kumbaya this week or what this would look like. So if you weren't with us last week, we started this brand new series called I've Got Questions, and the design of this conversation is to delve deep into the apparent conflict, tension between faith and science. And what we talked about is that, from my perspective, is it's an apparent tension, but not a real one. And you know, if you're a guest here this morning, one of the things that we pride ourselves on is this idea that following Jesus makes us better at life and makes our lives better. And so therefore, normally our series are centered around very everyday marriage, relationship, financial kinds of things, because we think Jesus is first and foremost relevant to our everyday desires to live and love and serve people well. And so this series takes on a little bit more of a cerebral intellectual form, or I guess you get to be the judge of that. But what we're doing here is jumping into what is a bit of a hot topic, because what research is telling us is the number one reason people are leaving faith or just altogether not considering it, especially students, is the apparent tension between faith and science. And that the main part of that tension deals with faith and human origins and how we speak to that and how do we account for what human genome theory is beginning to tell us and the myriad questions that come with that. So the reality is this series might not be for you. And I don't mean like you're not welcome, but I mean it might not be speaking to pressing needs in your life. If you're not in an academic setting, if you don't work in a scientific field, if you're very comfortable thinking about life from the faith side and the science questions don't bug you, that's great. And we're not trying to create a crisis for you, but we are trying to speak to the reality that for many of us, we don't have that luxury, that we're going to sit in advanced biology classes and microbiology classes, and we're going to go to school and we work in fields of science, and not all of us are raised in these streams of faith where we're taught from a young age to make assumptions about the Bible. In fact, we're taught just the opposite, that science is the dominant voice. And so what we're trying to do is bring to the surface some conversations that push against this notion that the conflict is between faith and science. And let me just kind of bottom line you this morning, because I think it might be boring. And so I'm just going to kind of tell you, like, if you fall asleep and you get nothing else, what I want to suggest to you this morning is that the conflict between faith and science isn't the real conflict. That the real conflict is between faith and hedonism, between faith and a notion of life that says that God is nowhere near here and he doesn't care about how we live, and that if we can identify that in these conversations and go, wait a minute, we're not talking faith and science right now, we're talking one worldview versus another worldview, then I think we can level the playing field in these conversations. So, in an attempt to avoid controversy this morning, first ales and then this, here's where I want to jump off at this morning, is simply this: did God die in 1859? Now, 1859 refers to the year that Darwin's Origin of Species was published. I learned this week that it was published on my birthday, November 24th. I was like, Lord, is that a sign? Like, I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do with that information. It was a little weird. And then my science friend told me it's like a 0.3% chance that would occur. But nonetheless, what I want to get at here is it Jesus or Darwin? Is it Genesis 1 in the Bible or evolutionary theory? Like, if true, does evolutionary theory disprove the existence of God? Is that really what's at stake? And of course, my argument this morning is going to say it's not, but I think we need to spend some time talking about this. N.T. Wright, to whom I am indebted this morning, he's written a book. If you've ever tried to read N.T. Wright, it's easier to do it in a language that you don't read, because then you understand why it doesn't make sense. I find him very difficult to read, but every once in a while he produces shorter books for lower intelligence people like myself, and he produced one called Surprised by Scripture. It's a fascinating book, and in there he tells a story. He tells a story about a man from India walking the streets of Dublin, Ireland, and of course let's just stop and remind ourselves that at one point Ireland was its source of its own, dare we call it, terrorism between Catholics and Protestants. But this Indian man was walking the streets of Dublin when some youth approached him rather aggressively and said, "What are you, Catholic or Protestant?" And this man from India took a deep breath and said, "I'm neither. I'm Hindu." And they said, "Yeah, but are you Catholic Hindu or Protestant Hindu?" And I love this story because it exposes the danger of dichotomy, right? That when we come to the conclusion there are only two categories, we kind of get trapped because we start forming stuff and forcing stuff into these categories that that maybe it's the lack of a third category that gets us in all the trouble. So here's another way to ask this question, which I think reveals for some of you what you think are the only two options, and for others of you, the absurdity, if not the frustration of it, is simply this. Which are you? A fundamentalist creationist or an atheistic evolutionist or scientist? This is N.T. Wright's question, and I think it appropriately exposes the nerve, don't you? Because some of you are like, that's the trap. I don't know which one. Because you feel like as a scientist, if these are the only two options, you've given your life to science, and therefore the faith one isn't an option. And yet, conversely, if we're not careful, we think a series like this is even designed to teach you how to step into a biology classroom and be a pain. And that's not really what we're trying to do, but trying to go like, how can we reframe this conversation? So the question becomes, how did we get at this place where we have such a dichotomy, where there's these apparent two options and no others? Well, to do so, it would be required that we look back, I think, historically, and this is the argument that I'm very indebted to N.T. Wright for, and I think shifts the entire conversation to a more relevant place. But it requires that we go back to 3rd century BC Greece and learn about a guy named Epicurus. Epicurus is, of course, the grandfather of Epicureanism, the inventor, you might say, I don't know what the appropriate term is, the first thinker of what is called Epicureanism. Epicureanism is a lesser-known worldview by name, but prevalent in what we know as a secular world. See, Epicurus, his fundamental disconnect with the Greek world, and it would seem that he was his own version of a rogue, but his fundamental disconnect was the way Greek spirituality frightened people into believing in God. The way Greek spirituality caused people to fear what would happen to them at their death if they didn't live their life according to the gods. And so Epicureanism, one kind of summary would be to simply say this, that God doesn't exist, so stop worrying about it and enjoy your lives. That was his message to the ancient Greek world. And it didn't gain a very broad audience, but that was his message. Like this God, it wasn't deistic. Deism would say that God created it and left. Epicureanism would say God may or may not exist, but either way, he's way the heck out there and never been involved in the created order. One summary of Epicureanism says it this way, that God lives at the top of the building, and we live at the bottom, and the stairs were destroyed long ago, and the elevator has never worked. So Epicureanism at its core is the assumption that God is completely uninvolved, if he exists at all, and that therefore we're not accountable for our lives. Now, his thinking and teaching was for thousands of years, a very small percentage of people adopted it because, quite frankly, it was for elites. If you were among the 95% of people who lived in this world in a subsistence economy, who struggled for their survival, who dealt with real everyday stuff, they couldn't live. This is like Scientology for us. This is us like, yeah, the Lamborghini dealership has great coffee, but that doesn't matter to me. Like, it's never going to be relevant to my life. For the 95% who lived these completely different lives than we come to assume as middle-class Americans, it was offensive. It's like walking into a terminal cancer ward and saying, God doesn't exist, so stop worrying about it and enjoy your life. Well, thank you. Like walking into an orphanage and going, God doesn't exist, so stop worrying about it and enjoy your life. You've just, whether true or not, you've just completely removed any sense of hope they might otherwise have. And so Epicureanism was a very it was a very small contingent of people. It was embraced by very affluent kinds of people. Fast forward, and of course there were these small followings throughout history, but Lucretius becomes the next big name of this whole movement. Lucretius lived 70 years before Jesus, and Lucretius, what makes him noteworthy is Lucretius, there's a couple ironic things, well, one very ironic thing in my view, but the other thing that Lucretius did, he's the first, best I can tell, best the research can tell, he was the first to link Epicureanism with science. He was the first one to go, wait a minute, we can do better than just God probably doesn't exist. We can point to science and we can say that creation as we know it is simply the result of a collision of atoms, and therefore God certainly doesn't exist, so stop worrying about it and enjoy your life. He was torqued about how Roman pagan theology, this is kind of crazy to think about this, and it's a completely separate conversation. He was torqued about the fact that Roman pagan theology threatened people with the fear of burning at death if they didn't live their lives right. And he goes, you didn't have to live in fear of that. This God, these gods, they don't even exist. And yet still it maintained a very minor status in what is especially Western Europe. But then the Middle Ages happened. And listen, I'm not a historian, but I can certainly plagiarize people who are. And my rudimentary understanding of the Middle Ages is that what happened with the Middle Ages, at least in part, was that mechanization and technology allowed for the rise of the middle class. That you moved from this feudal system where you had a very small percentage of people who owned all the land and had all the resource, kings and queens and popes and things like that, where you had these very small percentage of people who had the resource and everybody else eked out an existence. The Middle Ages created mechanization, it created technology, it created a middle class, and the middle class had this growing desire to topple that hierarchy. The middle class was sick and tired of the divinely appointed authority. Because see, the answer for hundreds of years had been, why is he king and I'm nobody? And the answer was, because God made him king. And the answer for the question for a long time was, why do they get everything and we get nothing? And the answer was, because that's how God made it. But with Epicureanism and a rising middle class who had this desire to topple that hierarchy, to call it into question, to stop living within that system, Epicureanism, many would say, provided the worldview leverage they needed to justify disempowering the nobles. Because if the gods don't exist, and if the science says they don't exist, then how much more does that give them permission to bring the social upheaval that they wanted? And then came the earthquake in Lisbon in 1755. This earthquake, in fact, if you study it, if you Wikipedia it, it was very much the first moment that has led now to a whole host of technology as it relates to earthquakes. Estimates are that it was a 9 to 9.5 on the scale. It happened just off the coast of Lisbon. Estimates are that as many as 100,000 people died that day. But it gets worse. See, the catch was it occurred on Sunday. And not just on Sunday, it occurred on All Saints' Day, which is a high holiday for Catholics. So you had this social situation where people were sick and tired of the feudal system. They were sick and tired of the divinely appointed kings. They wanted to bring about change to that. And then you had an earthquake that many historians would say served as the proverbial last straw, where people went, wait a minute. If this God exists, why would he not prevent that? Especially when those who died were his people in his buildings singing his songs in his name. So before we go anywhere else, part of what I want to demonstrate here this morning is that historically and philosophically, this idea of when was God ushered outside of town, we haven't even got to Darwinian theory yet. That there was an emotional, philosophical commitment to showing God the outskirts of town. And then Darwin published, 100 years later, his Origin of Species. And you can begin to see then how the growing scholarly conversation, especially the one that I'm privy to and have researched, there's this conversation of we think that the catalyst to this whole thing was Darwin, and it wasn't. It was a worldview that had been in motion for a long time. He, if anything, put a cherry on top. But that, I think, raises this question. If true, if evolutionary theory is true, does that disprove God's existence? Well, we could ask again, which are you, a fundamentalist creationist or an atheistic scientist? How did we get here? And here for me, and listen, this you might have to take a few swings at this and think about this and talk about this to be sure. It took me a while to wrap my brain around it, but this question for me has so clarified how I'm thinking about this. Like last week we asked this, what if the Bible is an ancient book and what's an act of communication? For me, step 2, movement 2 in that whole thing is this. What if causation isn't a zero-sum game? Now, causation, let's just kind of make sure we're all on the same terms at the risk of me being patronizing. Causation refers to how do we explain why things happen, right? Zero sum refers to that it's one or the other. In a business realm, zero sum would be for my coffee shop to survive, all other coffee shops have to fail, right? And it's this very gross, very scarce, I think very unlike the generosity of Jesus mindset, because what we understand is, I think good business understands that the size of the pie is not fixed, that we can all be successful, if you will. So what if causation, how we attribute causes to things, isn't a zero-sum game? In other words, what if it's not either God or science? And how did we get caught in this dichotomy where it has to be one or the other, right? Like cancer, was it God? Or was it human environment and exposure and genetics? Or or some success. You probably all had that awkward moment of good job, and you go, it was God. Well, but are we comfortable with what sometimes sound like these absurd answers? I think one way to delve into this is to relook at the story that some of you may be aware of from the movie Sully about Chesley Sullenberger III. And just to set the table here, remember, if you're not aware, in 2009, a plane took off from LaGuardia Airport in New York, and a couple minutes into flight, hit a flock of birds, and what followed was a series of pretty awesome, absurd events. What we're going to watch here is a video. It's kind of a little weird in that it's a digital reenactment of the flight, and parlayed over top of that is the actual voice recordings and the communication, which you'll see on the screen between pilots and all kinds of things. There's a moment where there's some silence in there, and that's by design, so don't get awkward and start pitting out like there's a technical problem. But I just want you to take all this in and begin to put all of this conversation about causation inside of this moment. So I invite you to turn your attention to the screens.
Right, 150.
Join 2760, climb maintain 10,000.
10,000, join 2760.
Cactus 1549, turn left lane 270.
This is Cactus 1539. Hit birds through lost thrust on both engines, returning back towards LaGuardia.
Overhead. Okay, you need to return to LaGuardia. Turn left heading up 220.
220.
Tower, stop your departure. He's got emergency returning. Cactus 1529. He bird strike. He lost all engines. He lost the thrust in the engines. He's returning immediately.
Cactus 1529. Which engines?
He lost thrust in both engines, he said.
Got it.
Cactus 1529. If we can get it for you, do you want to try to land runway 13?
Go ahead.
Yeah, the Cactus 1549 that just departed.
1529 or 49? Somebody just said 1529.
1549.
Okay, 1549. Got a bird strike.
Yeah.
Lost his thrust in both engines. He's
That's
returning.
what he thinks.
No, he's going to 31.
He wants to return immediately, and he wants to land runway 31.
Got it. Runway 31.
All right, Cactus 1549. It's going to be left traffic to runway 31.
Unable.
Okay, what do you need to land?
And runway 4 is available if he needs it.
Okay, runway 4 is available. Thank you, Tower. We'll get back to you.
Cactus 1549. Runway 4 is available if you want to make left traffic to runway 4.
I'm not sure we can make any runway. What's over to our right? Anything in New Jersey, maybe Teterboro?
Okay, yeah, off your right side is Teterboro Airport. Do you want to try to go to Teterboro?
Yes.
Teterboro, Empire. Actually, LaGuardia departure guy, emergency inbound.
Hey, go ahead.
Cactus 1529 over the George Washington Bridge. Wants to go to your airport right now.
Wants to go to our airport. Check. Does he need assistance?
Yes, it was a bird strike. Can I get him in for runway 1?
Runway 1, that's good.
Cactus 1529, turn right 280. You can land runway 1 at Teterboro.
We can't do it.
Okay, which runway would you like at Teterboro?
We're going to be
I'm sorry, say again, Cactus?
He wants to land here.
All right. Kelly, 2760, contact New York 12618.
2668, join 2760.
Tower.
Yeah, Tower, what's your line?
Okay, listen. We're going to tell you something important. It's Cactus 1549. We see somebody low level in the Hudson River below 400, okay? You're going to need to alert the New York and New Jersey Port Authority police over there.
New York and New Jersey Port Authority.
Okay, he's on the Hudson River. He's just about a mile and a half north of the Lincoln Tunnel. Last sighted below 900 feet. We still got a target on him, but he looks like he's low level.
Okay.
Okay?
All right, good.
And that's Cactus 1549, 1549er.
1549, and what airline is that?
U.S. Air, Cactus.
Okay, thanks.
You can fly 4718, climb maintain 2000.
Yeah, 1000 and even 5 at 280.
County LaGuardia.
Cactus going down.
Kelly,
Get me a police department helicopter if you got one on your frequency.
Get the water.
say again?
Get me a police department helicopter if you got one on your frequency right
We
now.
don't have one now. We'll make a call.
You get anybody, you send them right over to the Lincoln Tunnel. We had a Cactus Airbus go down in the water.
Anybody want to go to the airport? So I think here's the question: was that a miracle? And to what do we attribute that? Right? I mean, was that a function of God and His involvement? Was that a function of science? And listen, I like many of you, am a Christ follower. I center my life on this existence of this God and the tension between our free will and His sovereign control. But if we're not careful, don't we run too quickly past the fact that this captain had 30 years of commercial flight experience, and not only that, he was a trainer, and not only that, he enjoyed flying gliders, which it turns out comes in handy when you have a double loss of power on an airplane. Like, what do we do with the fact that what outside experts say is that he made a series of lightning-fast decisions, and every one of them was the perfect decision, followed by a series of incredibly complex aeronautical maneuvers? Like, what do we do with that? And you see how, for me, this question of what is causation, a zero-sum game, kind of gets us trapped? Like, which pole in that scenario are you comfortable with? See, here's where I think the text becomes this brilliant tool, because what we see is the compiled stories of people of faith who have wrestled with the same things you and I wrestle with. Different context for sure, but questions like, where is God and how is He involved and how do I make sense of the circumstances of our lives, my life? And what we see in the text is that these people constantly were struggling between these two poles, but in the Bible, causation is not a zero-sum game, and one of the ironic places we could see that is in the way the Bible talks about creation. Genesis 1. You know, the New Testament authors, Paul or any of the others, in the 27 books, none of the authors attempt to give us a new creation theology. Now, sure, there's these snippets, but none of them attempt to reconstruct creation theology in the New Testament, which should lead to the question, why? And one potential answer, if not the most obvious one, is because the Bible already had one, and they knew it. It was found in Genesis 1. And from the very beginning of Jewish thinking on through Christ-following theology is this basic assumption that creation is the good and wise creation of a good and wise God. And what you see in Genesis 1 is this God who's a part of creation, whose interest is not how many 24-hour days were involved in creation, but the general notion that this God is present and involved. Listen, the Bible is written in the context of Epicureanism. The battle was not against biology. The battle was against this notion that even if God existed, He's way the heck out there. And you have biblical people of faith going, no. That's never been how our God has told us the story. It's always been of a God who's here and present and somehow involved. And even in Genesis 1, you hear these statements like God creates plants and trees that produce fruit, which in turn produce seeds, which in turn produce more plants and trees. And He creates animals and creatures of the sea, who in turn produce more animals and creatures of the sea. And then He creates humans, who they tend to have a lot of fun, like creating more humans, like it's this thing they enjoy doing. And then He says of people like, hey, I'm going to make you in my image. And you're going to reflect to creation the glory of God, and you're going to reflect back to God the praises of creation. N.T. Wright says it this way of Genesis 1. He says, God is said to have made a world that will then remake itself. Now, was the author of Genesis aware of evolutionary theory? Of course, he or she was not. But nonetheless, you see this accommodation of these both parts of this equation. And again, in the context of Epicureanism, the text begins to speak. One scholar, and I referenced him on your mind map, he wrote a book called Finding God in the Lost World of Genesis 1, and it's this remarkable read, if not difficult, and it's very respected in the academic world. But what he demonstrates is that the original audience would have seen in Genesis 1 the construction of a temple, that this God was constructing for Himself a temple, which begs the question, where? Was it on the moon? Was it in some kind of abstract place removed from the planet? No, where was this God creating a temple? On the planet. And remember, these were Jewish people who were living their lives in the context of what is ultimately a hedonistic idea that says, listen, you don't have to worry about God because He's not anywhere near here. And they were going, no. This God has always been about this intersection between the created order and the divine order. He's always been here. And then you have Genesis 3 and Genesis 6, which talk about the brokenness, what we call the fall, and then this weird moment where these angels come from heaven and they start making a mess on the planet, and we're not sure how we make sense of all that. But one picture is very clear by the end of Genesis 6. This God wanted to be present on the planet, and things are messed up. The only other option is Epicureanism. This God has never been involved. Or I suppose there's a third, that nothing's wrong. And yet who's willing to say that? Listen to Psalm 65, and again, I think this is just, it captures the heart and the real life thinking of people who were trying to live out what you and I are trying to live out. It says, who formed the mountains by your power, having armed yourself with strength? Who stilled the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, and the turmoil of the nations? The whole earth is filled with awe at your wonders, where morning dawns, where evening fades, you call forth songs of joy. Also, the Bible's wrong, because this is bad science. Or, the Bible's not trying to give us science. It's reflecting what you experience, perhaps when you go for a hike, or you're on a beach, or when your child was born, where you have these transcendent moments of like, wait a minute, there's more in play here than just what I can see and touch. See, I wonder if the next time we're led into this trap of, so which one are you? Fundamentalist creationist or atheistic scientist? You go, I'm neither, I'm Hindu. Don't do that. That'll even make it more complicated. But you get the point. Like, wait a minute. I think what we're trying to have right now is a conversation on causation. And causation is a philosophical conversation about God's involvement in the world. But science and evolutionary theory, those things we can disagree on, but they're not what we're really talking about anymore. Listen to Jesus, who was asked one time, how do you pray? And remember, we did a whole conversation about this, one of my favorite ever last year, called the Lord's Prayer. And we just broke this down. And listen to verse 9. Our Father in heaven. Remember heaven, and we've talked about this last week. Heaven refers to, it starts at the top of your head. Again, take this in the context of an Epicurean worldview. This is like in your face Greek philosophers. This is like, no. God is not far away. He's our Father who is right here. That's what Jesus is saying. You don't live in a godless world. You live in a God-saturated world, which is also a highly complex scientific world. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. That the whole design of this thing was to point us to God. The Catholics have been saying for hundreds of years, we have a fifth gospel, and it's called creation. Not because they were threatened by creation, but because they saw that creation and its beauty and its complexity and its wonder, it points to God. And then look at the third part here. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Is that not a confession of sorts? Acknowledgement that things are broken and messed up and not as they're supposed to be? Is that not this acknowledgement of like, wait a minute? And yet it's also an invitation, isn't it? An invitation of a God who goes, right here. I'm right here. And we're making sense of this. We're putting it back together. See, the naturalist would have us see God or Jesus as a moral teacher who came to teach us how to get on in this life. What I want to argue, the hyper-supernaturalist would have us believe that Jesus came to rescue us from this order, to get us the heck out of here because it's broken. Neither conveys the story of the Gospels of a Jesus who came and inaugurated the kingdom and went to the cross and resurrected in order to say, God's not abandoning ship. He's committed to restoring what he originally had in mind. And so Jesus says, hey, when you pray, why don't you frame your day with this idea that God's close? And why don't you remind yourself that part of the existence is designed to point you and others back to his awesomeness? And then why don't you step into the invitation that you, should you choose, can be this place, this divine conspiracy where God's kingdom breaks into his created order now. What I love about the text is it never claims where evil came from. The origination, the source, it doesn't answer those questions, but it does tell us that it exists, that God is committed to making it right, and it invites us to be a part of that with him. What if our conversations ought to center more on, is what we're really talking about right now is where is God and how involved is he? Are you really comfortable with an explanation of life that says it's all science? Listen, I don't know where your faith story is at right now and what kind of side of that pole you're coming at it from. I do think Jesus brings to the table a remarkable invitation for all of us, whether we've never heard it before or the challenge is to hear it afresh and anew every day, and that is that the purpose of our lives is an invitation from God to be a continuation of his story to break into this world with his love and justice and proper use of power. Jesus, thanks for your Son. Thanks for the historic church and the shoulders of those whom we stand on as we try to make sense of our lives today and your revelation. God, as we wrestle with this stuff, be it academically or emotionally or socially or philosophically, would you keep the conversation centered on what's really at stake, which is your presence and existence in the world. God, thanks for your what it seems radical assertion that you didn't make it and leave, and it didn't happen without any design in mind, but that you are God and you were behind it, that you know us. And Jesus, would you help us use our short, tiny lives to hallow your name? Amen.
If you would like to engage further with Narrate Church, you can find contact information online, www.narratechurch.org. We would love to hear from you.